Before the muskets fired, there was silence, the kind that comes before the world changes. In the hills and valleys of New England, life moved to the rhythm of the seasons, not the politics of kings. Dawn broke over fields of frost-tipped corn and stone walls built by hand. The smell of wood smoke hung in the air as farmers rose before the sun, their breath white in the morning chill. They were men of calloused hands and quiet faith. Their world measured not in laws and taxes, but in harvests and prayers. In the villages, blacksmiths hammered iron into plowshares and hinges, millers ground grain by the river's edge, and mothers spun wool by the hearth. Sundays filled the meetinghouses, weekdays filled the fields. Talk of empire and parliament seemed as distant as the sea, carried only by the occasional trader or newspaper from Boston. The Crown's authority was real, but far away. Its touch felt mostly in stamped paper, customs duties, and the price of imported tea. Life here was simple, and that simplicity bred both contentment and independence. Yet beneath the peace, something restless stirred. The farmers who toiled from dawn to dusk had begun to notice how much of their labor fed not their own families, but the coffers of men they would never meet. Each year brought new taxes, new laws, new restrictions on what they could sell and what they could buy. The British flag flew over their towns, but it offered little more than shadowed protection. For many, the idea of being ruled by distant strangers began to feel less like safety and more like servitude. Around the tavern fires, whispers spread. A preacher might quote scripture about bondage and deliverance, his voice rising just enough for men at the back to exchange knowing glances. Farmers who once spoke only of weather and crops now argued about liberty and tyranny, their words awkward but passionate. The notion that ordinary men might one day stand against the empire seemed absurd, and yet no one laughed anymore when someone said it aloud. Still, for most, life continued unchanged. The plough cut through the same soil, the cows were milked before dawn, children chased each other through the churchyard, unaware of the storm forming beyond the horizon. The empire's decrees arrived slowly, like distant thunder, rumbling across the Atlantic long before the lightning struck. But even those who could not name the coming danger could sense it. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Before the muskets fired, the world was ordinary, and perhaps that is what made what followed so extraordinary. The revolution was not born in cities or palaces, but in fields like these, where men who asked for nothing more than freedom to live and labor would soon be asked to fight for something greater. The soil of America was ready, and history was about to take root. The seeds of liberty were sown not in cities, but in fields. Long before shots were fired or flags were raised, rebellion began in the furrows of the countryside, where men bent over their crops and began to question why their sweat seemed to profit someone else's crown. The soil gave freely, but the empire did not. Each harvest brought not just grain and corn, but the sting of taxes, duties, and decrees written by men across an ocean. What had once felt like distant governance was now an ever-tightening grip. The British Empire's reach extended down every muddy road and into every barn. Customs officers appeared at wharves and warehouses, demanding stamps and payments. New laws dictated what could be sold and where, forcing farmers to ship their goods through British ports at British prices. Iron, salt, and cloth all bore the mark of London's monopoly. Even the tools that turned the fields or the nails that built a barn were priced higher by imperial decree. The plough might have been local, but the profit was foreign. For men who had once seen themselves as loyal subjects, the realization came slowly, like a storm cloud building on the horizon. They began to notice the small indignities, the way British officials spoke down to them, the arrogance in every inspection, the quiet threat behind every new law. A farmer who had never seen a redcoat now felt his presence in every coin he earned and every sack of grain he sold. The tyranny was invisible, but its weight was real. In taverns and meetinghouses, talk turned from grievance to warning. "They tax our tea today," one man muttered, "but what will they tax tomorrow our land, our children?" The older men shook their heads, wary of speaking treason, yet their silence was no longer agreement. The younger ones spoke boldly, their words carrying the sharpness of men with little left to lose. Freedom was no longer an idea belonging to philosophers in Boston. It was becoming the hunger of the farmer, the prayer of the laborer. Still, the rebellion was not yet a roar but a murmur beneath the surface. Men went about their chores, their faces calm, but their tempers hardening like the iron they forged. Wives counted coins and came up short. Merchants grumbled as their profits vanished into British coffers. Each injustice was a seed, small, buried, unseen but alive. In time, those seeds would take root. They would sprout in the hearts of men who had never imagined themselves heroes, men who only wanted to be left in peace. But the empire had reached too far, for too long, and in the quiet of those New England fields, where the sound of the plough once ruled the day, another rhythm began to grow, the steady, rising heartbeat of revolution. The revolution began with ink as much as gunpowder. Before the smoke of muskets clouded the skies, the smell of fresh ink filled the air of New England's towns. Words, simple, fiery, dangerous, travelled faster than soldiers ever could. They came printed on coarse paper, carried in saddlebags, nailed to church doors, and read aloud beside hearths. To many farmers, it was the first time the empire's power had been described not as divine, but as deceit. And once the words were read, they could not be forgotten. In small print shops that rattled with every turn of the press, men like Isaiah Thomas risked ruin to publish pamphlets that Parliament called sedition. His presses clattered through the night, turning fear into fury, ink into defiance. Broadsides denounced the tyranny of taxation, pamphlets urged resistance, and newspapers from Boston to Worcester carried the sharp tongues of writers who saw truth as their weapon. Every copy that passed from hand to hand was another musket loaded, only this one fired ideas instead of lead. In the meetinghouses and parishes, the pulpits became pulpits of revolution. Ministers who once preached obedience began to thunder about freedom as divine will. "There can be no king but Christ," they cried, their sermons echoing through wooden rafters and into the hearts of their flocks. Faith and rebellion intertwined, scripture becoming a sword sharper than steel. For farmers who could not read, these words were revelation proof that liberty itself might be holy. It was not only men who carried these messages. Women read the pamphlets to their husbands by candlelight, and children listened wide-eyed to the talk of justice and rights. Whole families gathered in kitchens as if at secret meetings, whispering the words of common sense long before it bore that name. The British had muskets and regiments, the colonies had voices and conviction. And that, it turned out, was enough to begin a war of hearts. The Crown tried to silence the presses, ordering printers to swear loyalty or shut down. But paper found its way into barns and cellars, presses hidden behind false walls, ink mixed by lamplight. The more the empire tried to suppress the message, the louder it became. What had started as a debate among merchants and scholars was now being spoken in fields, in churches, and in every corner of a restless countryside. By the time the first powder was poured into muskets, the greater explosion had already happened in the mind. Each pamphlet, each sermon, each whispered word had prepared the ground for rebellion. Ideas had become ammunition, and belief had become a weapon. The revolution was no longer a question of if, but when. And when it came, it would come not only from the barrel of a gun, but from the fire that words had lit. They weren't soldiers, they were farmers who could fight at a minute's notice. Across Massachusetts, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer was joined by the crack of musket fire from fields turned into makeshift training grounds. These were not barracks or parade squares, but pastures and commons, where men who had never seen war now drilled with grim resolve. They were fathers, sons, and neighbours, ordinary men who still rose before dawn to milk cows, mend fences, and till the earth, yet kept a musket by the door as if war might knock at any hour. The British Army called them amateurs, but the colonists called them Minutemen. The name carried both pride and promise. They would be ready in 60 seconds to defend their homes, their families, and their freedom. Each town formed its own company, choosing captains from among themselves, farmers who had earned respect, not from rank, but from character. Their uniforms were homespun, their powder horns carved by hand, their boots often muddy from the same fields they would one day defend. Training was crude but earnest. Men gathered after work, lining up along stone walls or beside frozen rivers, practicing the turn and aim of the musket. The air filled with the smell of black powder and the sound of shouted orders that often ended in laughter. Yet behind that laughter was something deadly serious. Every man knew that if the British marched from Boston, it would be their own farms that burned first. They drilled not for glory, but for survival. For many, the decision to join came with quiet conflict. Some wives begged their husbands to stay home, to think of the children, of the winter, of the hunger that might follow. Others stood beside them, proud and afraid, knowing the fight for liberty might one day take the man who ploughed their fields. Fathers passed down muskets to sons barely grown, their hands lingering on the barrels as if offering both weapon and blessing. The Revolution's first army was born not from command, but from love. On cold evenings, when the drills were done, the men gathered in taverns or barns to share ale and conviction. They spoke of rights, of God, of what it meant to be free. They had no battle plans, no professional discipline, only the belief that liberty, once taken, could never be returned. When they looked across the fields at the flickering lights of their neighbours' homes, they understood what they were fighting for. They were farmers, cobblers, blacksmiths, and millers, but together they became something greater. They did not yet call it revolution, only duty. But in their hands, the tools of peace became instruments of defiance. The Minutemen stood ready not as soldiers of a nation, but as guardians of a promise, and when history called, they would answer before the echo had even faded. Even the quietest villages began to tremble with rumour. In the winter of 1774, whispers moved faster than any courier. The king's soldiers were coming. Some said to seize gunpowder, others said to hang the ringleaders of rebellion. No one knew which was true, and that made every rumour believable. The countryside, once ruled by the rhythm of harvest and Sabbath, now throbbed with unease. Doors that had always stood open were now barred at night, lanterns burned later, and voices lowered when strangers passed. The British crackdown was felt even miles from Boston. Soldiers stopped wagons on the roads, searching for smuggled goods or contraband arms. Loyalist informers crept through taverns, pretending to drink while listening for treason. In response, town meetings grew tense and crowded. The people gathered in cold halls and churchyards, their breath visible in the air as they argued over what to do. Some called for calm, warning that defiance would bring destruction. Others demanded preparation powder, shot, and courage. In barns and cellars, the militias quietly built their stores. Muskets were repaired, powder kegs hidden under hay, lead bars melted into bullets by candlelight. Farmers who had never held a weapon now handled them with the familiarity of survival. Women sewed cartridge pouches beside the fire, while children carried messages between households under the pretense of errands. The rebellion was no longer an idea, it was an industry. Still, not every village stood united. Old friends began to eye each other with suspicion. A careless word at a tavern could turn into an accusation. The line between loyalty and liberty blurred with every new decree from the crown. For many, the fear was not of war itself, but of what war would do to their own communities, to families that prayed together, traded together, and now might one day fire upon each other. In the meetinghouses, tempers boiled. "We are not rebels," one farmer shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "We are Englishmen defending our rights." But the word rebel lingered, heavy and electric. Ministers preached of duty and providence, while blacksmiths sharpened blades meant for harvest tools, but ready for more. The countryside had once been the calm heart of the colonies, now it pulsed with restless defiance. By spring, the peace was gone. Every church bell sounded like an alarm, every hoofbeat on the road a warning. The people still ploughed their fields and milked their cows, but they did so with muskets close at hand. The war had not yet arrived, but everyone could feel it, the invisible weight pressing on their chests, the sense that something immense was drawing near. The quiet world of New England had cracked, and through that crack, revolution was beginning to breathe. When the soldiers left Boston, they thought they were marching toward order, not history. In the cold, grey hours before dawn on April 19, 1775, the British regulars moved out in silence. Bayonets glinted faintly in the moonlight, boots pressing into the damp earth of the road westward. To the officers leading them, this was no grand campaign, just a routine mission to seize a cache of colonial weapons hidden at Concord. They expected to find frightened farmers, not an army. They expected obedience, not resistance. General Thomas Gage, the commander in Boston, had ordered the expedition reluctantly. Reports had reached him that the countryside was bristling with rebellion, that powder and shot were being hoarded, that Minutemen were drilling openly in defiance of the Crown. His orders were clear: confiscate the weapons, arrest the agitators, and restore calm. To London, it was a matter of discipline. To the colonies, it was a matter of survival. As the column crossed the Charles River under the cover of night, small boats ferrying them silently to the Cambridge shore, the soldiers whispered among themselves. Many were young and weary of the tension that had hung over Boston for months. They longed for a clean, swift operation, a march, a search, a return before breakfast. But among the officers, a few sensed the gravity of the moment. "One misstep," Major Pitcairn muttered to a companion, "and we light a fire we cannot put out." They were not the only ones awake. Along the country roads ahead, riders were already in motion. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott carried the alarm through sleeping villages, their hooves striking sparks on the frozen ground. "The regulars are out," they shouted at every door, rousing men from their beds and hearts from their hesitation. Church bells began to toll, lanterns flared in windows. The farmers who had spent weeks in uneasy waiting now moved with certainty. The war that had existed only in rumour was finally real. Through the night, the British marched deeper into the dark countryside, unaware that the land itself had turned against them. Scouts watched from the trees. Riders darted through the fields, carrying word faster than the soldiers could march. Each step forward drew them farther from safety and closer to a line they could never uncross. The silence of their march was an illusion. The colonies were already awake, armed, and waiting. By the time the first light touched the steeples of Lexington, the redcoats were no longer marching toward a simple errand of confiscation. They were marching into legend. Ahead lay a village green, a few dozen farmers with muskets, and the shot that would echo around the world. The British sought to crush rebellion. Instead, they would give it life. The march that began in confidence would end in chaos, and an empire would never be the same again. The road to revolution was ridden in darkness. On the night of April 18, 1775, the moon hung thin above the Charles River as three riders prepared to gamble their lives on speed and secrecy. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott knew that within hours, hundreds of British soldiers would be marching toward Concord to seize colonial weapons, and that if they failed to spread the warning, the revolution might die before it began. Their mission was simple: awaken a sleeping countryside. Their odds of surviving it were not. In Boston, Revere had waited for his signal, two lanterns glimmering from the steeple of the Old North Church, the message clear. The British were crossing by sea. Within minutes, he was on horseback, galloping through the night, the wind biting his face. Behind him, Dawes rode out by land through Roxbury, while Prescott, a country doctor, would join them later on the road. They were not soldiers, but messengers of destiny, racing time itself. The countryside slept, but not for long. Hooves thundered over dirt roads, and fists pounded on doors. "Up an arm! The regulars are coming!" Revere cried as he passed through Medford, his voice shattering the stillness. Windows flew open, candles lit, and farmers leapt from their beds. Muskets were pulled from mantles, powder horns filled. and wives packed food into the hands of men already halfway out the door. In village after village, the alarm spread like wildfire. Each mile was a race against capture. British patrols scoured the roads, hoping to cut off the riders before the alarm reached Concord. Revere was seized for a time, his horse surrounded by redcoats who demanded his purpose. "You'll miss the end of it," he told them coolly, knowing that the countryside was already awake. Dawes escaped into the dark, and Prescott, leaping his horse over a stone wall, broke free and continued alone, his lantern bobbing like a ghost light across the fields. Behind them, bells began to ring and drums to beat. The blacksmith left his forge, the parson left his Bible, the farmer left his plough. By the light of flickering torches, men gathered on the greens of Lexington and Concord, forming ranks of determination more than discipline. The revolution was no longer words on pamphlets or speeches in taverns. It was movement, motion, the sound of hooves striking history's door. By dawn, the riders' work was done. The alarm had carried farther than any musket shot, across towns, counties, and hearts. What began as 3 men in the night had become a nation stirring to its feet. When the sun rose over the Massachusetts hills, it found not a colony asleep under empire, but a people wide awake and ready to fight for their freedom. From one village to the next, the countryside caught fire. The alarm that began as a whisper in the night became a roar that shook the dawn. Bells clanged from church towers, dogs barked, drums beat, and the cry echoed through the narrow valleys of Massachusetts. To arms, to arms! What had been rumour and fear only days before now exploded into certainty. The British were on the march, and the time for talk was over. Farmers dropped their tools mid-furrow, hands still dirty with soil, and ran for their muskets. Blacksmiths left their forges glowing, hammers cooling on the anvils. From every barn, cottage, and meeting-house came the sound of preparation, powder horns filled, shot measured, boots pulled on in haste. Roads that had been empty a night before now thrummed with the tramp of men. The fields that once grew wheat now grew an army. At the edge of each village, families gathered in the half-light. Mothers pressed food into rough hands, wives tied scarves around their husbands' necks, children stood barefoot in the frost, too young to understand but old enough to remember. There were no speeches, no farewells worthy of history, only hurried embraces, and the knowledge that this morning might be the last they ever saw one another. The courage that filled those moments was quiet but unbreakable. Messengers rode from town to town, their horses lathered, their cloaks streaked with mud. Everywhere they went, the same response, men grabbing their weapons and marching toward the sound of alarm. Old veterans of the French wars joined boys barely past 15, their faces set with the same determination. Some carried muskets, others scythes or hunting rifles, but all carried the same conviction. They would not stand idle while their freedom was taken. By sunrise, the roads converged with columns of men heading toward Lexington and Concord. The morning air smelled of smoke and spring frost, and the sound of their footsteps rolled through the countryside like thunder. They came not as trained soldiers, but as citizens answering a call older than any king, the call to defend home. Behind them, the women and children watched the columns disappear over the hills, the echo of their footsteps fading into the still air. The farms they left behind would grow quiet, but not empty. Their spirit would linger in every field and furrow. From these humble villages, from the soil itself, the First Army of Liberty was rising, an army not born of command, but of conviction. And as the dawn widened across the land, the people of New England stood no longer as subjects of an empire, but as the authors of their own destiny. ChatGPT said, they stood on a village green and faced an empire. The morning of April 19th, 1775, broke cold and pale over Lexington. Mist clung to the fields, the grass silvered with dew. In the distance came the steady tramp of boots and the faint rattle of muskets. Captain John Parker, a veteran of old wars, stood at the head of his company 70 men, most of them farmers, millers, and blacksmiths. Their breath hung in the chill air as they formed a ragged line on the common. They were outnumbered 10 to 1, but none stepped back. The British column emerged from the haze, hundreds of redcoats, bayonets gleaming like the edge of morning itself. Major John Pitcairn rode at their front, his voice sharp, commanding the rebels to disperse. "Lay down your arms, ye villains," he shouted. But Parker's men stood silent. Some gripped their muskets tighter, others shifted nervously, hearts pounding loud enough to drown the distant drums. They did not come to fight, only to stand to show that free men would not yield without witness. Parker's order was calm, almost tender. "Stand your ground," he said. "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The words drifted through the mist like a prayer and a promise. Across the field, a horse snorted, a musket clicked, and for a moment the world held its breath. Then came the shot no one knew from where, and history lurched forward. In an instant, smoke and chaos swallowed the green. The redcoats fired in a shattering volley, and the men of Lexington scattered. Some returned fire, others fell where they stood. 8 lay dead when the smoke cleared, their blood soaking into the earth they had sworn to defend. The British reformed their ranks, their officers barking orders, their faces pale not from victory but from shock. The first blood of rebellion had been spilled, and it could never be called back. As the redcoats marched on toward Concord, the survivors gathered their wounded and stared after them, grief and fury burning in their eyes. They had not won, but they had endured. The line had been drawn not in ink or parchment, but in blood. Word of the clash began to spread within hours, carried by riders who shouted the news as if the very air demanded it. "They have fired on us." By nightfall, that small patch of grass would be known across the colonies. The shot fired at Lexington would echo far beyond the village green across oceans, across generations. It was the moment when farmers became soldiers, when defiance became revolution. On that morning, in a sleepy town at the edge of empire, the world changed forever. No one knows who fired first, only that the world was never the same again. By the time the British reached Concord on the morning of April 19th, 1775, smoke from Lexington still hung in the minds of every man. The redcoats marched into the village expecting surrender, but what they found was silence, a town emptied of men, its windows shuttered, its streets watched from the shadows. They spread out to search for hidden weapons, breaking open barrels, overturning carts, and setting fire to anything that might serve rebellion. The smoke of burning supplies curled above the rooftops, black against the pale spring sky. Across the river, on a hill overlooking the town, hundreds of militia gathered, farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen, their faces grim. They watched the flames rise and knew what it meant. Captain Isaac Davis, his musket clean and ready, turned to his men. "I haven't a man afraid to go," he said. With that, the columns began to move. Down the slope they came, the sun flashing on their gun barrels, hearts pounding louder than the drums they did not have. At the North Bridge, the British held their ground light infantry with polished muskets and crisp uniforms. They saw the militia advancing and shouted warnings, but the colonists kept coming, step by steady step. The bridge creaked beneath their boots, the river flowing cold and indifferent below. Then, from one side or the other, no one will ever say, came the crack of a musket. Smoke exploded into the air, followed by another shot, and another, until the morning erupted in thunder. The farmers answered with deadly aim. The British line wavered, then broke, soldiers stumbling backward as comrades fell beside them. For the first time, the Empire's army turned and ran. The men of Concord stood in stunned silence, as the redcoats fled down the road, the bridge littered with the wounded. It was chaos, but it was victory. The spell of British invincibility had been shattered by men who had spent their lives behind plows, not bayonets. When the fighting paused, the militiamen crossed the bridge and looked down at the still water running red with reflection. Some whispered prayers, others reloaded in silence. They had done what no one had believed possible. They had faced the might of the Empire and forced it to retreat. The war that Parliament had promised to prevent was now unstoppable. As the British retreated toward Boston, gunfire followed them mile after mile, from every field and forest. The colonies were alive, awake, and armed. In a single morning, rebellion had become revolution, and the echo of that first uncertain shot would travel farther than any musket ball across the sea, across centuries, carrying with it the birth cry of a new world. ChatGPT said, "An empire's army fled before farmers with pitchforks and muskets. The retreat from Concord began under a bright April sun, the day too beautiful for war. The British column, once proud and disciplined, now stumbled back toward Boston along the narrow country road, their red coats darkened with sweat and blood. What had started as a march of control had become a desperate fight for survival. The order of empire was unraveling in dust and smoke. The countryside had come alive. Every field, every stone wall, every thicket seemed to hold an armed man. Farmers who had never fired a shot in anger now aimed with the patience of hunters. From behind trees and fences came the crack of muskets, each volley tearing through the British ranks. The soldiers fired blindly into the woods, but their enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The quiet men of Massachusetts had turned the road home into a gauntlet. Major Pitcairn shouted himself hoarse, trying to hold the column together. "March! Keep marching!" he barked, though half his men could barely stand. Exhaustion and panic spread like fever. Wagons overturned, wounded men were left behind, and the road grew slick where blood mixed with spring mud. The empire that had ruled continents now measured its might in yards gained, not miles conquered. Along the ridges, militiamen passed powder horns and laughed grimly between shots. They had watched these same soldiers parade through Boston with polished boots and polished pride. Now they saw them breaking. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. The screams of the wounded carried on the wind. But beneath the horror was something new, a dawning realization that the impossible was happening. The British could be beaten. At Merriam's Corner, at Bloody Angle, and again at Menotomy, the ambushes struck with brutal precision. Every bend in the road became a trap. Reinforcements finally met the shattered column near Lexington, but even fresh troops could not erase the terror that had set in. The retreat had become a rout. By the time the Redcoats reached the safety of Boston's guns, they had marched nearly 20 miles through fire. 270 soldiers lay dead or wounded. The farmers they had scorned had sent an empire running. As night fell, the militiamen melted back into the fields, reloading their muskets for whatever came next. The air still trembled with gunfire's echo, but the silence that followed was different, thicker, charged, alive. The myth of British invincibility had died that day on the dusty road to Boston. In its place stood something far greater, the birth of belief. Ordinary men had faced the might of an empire and found themselves equal. The revolution had begun in earnest, and there was no turning back. ChatGPT said, "Boston became a fortress and a prison. In the weeks after Lexington and Concord, the British army huddled behind its walls, nursing its wounds and watching the hills beyond fill with the faces of men who would no longer kneel. From every village and farm, militiamen poured in thousands of them until the countryside around Boston swarmed like an armed hive. The hunters had become the besiegers. The empire's proud army, once the terror of the world, now found itself penned in by the very people it had sought to subdue. The city was trapped between bayonet and bay. British warships patrolled the harbour, their black hulls looming like threats against the skyline, while on the surrounding hills the colonists dug trenches and built earthworks. Smoke from 100 campfires drifted through the dawn mist. Farmers turned soldiers, sharpened bayonets beside ploughs, and whispered prayers before dawn. The siege lines stretched for miles, ragged, improvised, but resolute. Boston, once the heart of royal authority in New England, now beat under the pulse of rebellion. Inside the city, tension curdled into fear. Loyalists huddled in their homes, terrified of retribution. Food grew scarce, prices soared, and disease began to spread. Soldiers grumbled in the streets, hungry and restless, their discipline fraying with each passing day. General Gage watched from his headquarters, haunted by the knowledge that each sunrise brought more rebels to the hills. The soldiers who had marched so confidently to Concord now stared across the harbour at a countryside bristling with defiance. Beyond the city walls, the farmers prepared for the counterstrike they knew must come. They dug trenches through the night, their spades striking the rocky earth with stubborn rhythm. Muskets rested against fences, powder kegs hidden beneath blankets, eyes fixed on the horizon. They were not trained soldiers, yet they built fortifications with the same patience they brought to their fields. Between the scent of turned soil and gunpowder, liberty took physical form. Visitors to the camps wrote of a strange mixture of fear and faith. Men sang hymns as they stood watch, musket in one hand and Bible in the other. Some wrote letters home, unsure if they would ever return. Others simply waited, watching the city that had once ruled them now confined and trembling. For the first time in living memory, the balance of power had shifted. The countryside, the humble, stubborn heart of New England, held an empire hostage. Boston's siege was more than a military standoff, it was a symbol. The farmers who had once bent beneath the weight of British law now stood above the soldiers sent to enforce it. The city's red roofs glowed in the morning sun, surrounded by a ring of rebellion that tightened with every day. The empire had thought to crush a revolt in the fields, but the fields had risen up and captured the empire instead. In the gunpowder's haze, 13 colonies began to see themselves as one. News of the fighting at Lexington and Concord travelled faster than any army, carried by riders through mud, storm, and sleepless night. Within days, it reached New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, each town lighting with the same mix of shock and pride. What had been a skirmish in a distant province now belonged to everyone. From Virginia's tobacco fields to New Hampshire's rocky farms, men looked north and saw not Massachusetts in rebellion, but America awakening. Taverns buzzed with talk of the battles, of farmers standing against redcoats, of courage forged from desperation. Newspapers printed stories that blurred fact and legend, how the British had fled, how the farmers had fought with divine fury. The details mattered less than the spirit. In every colony, men nodded to one another and said, "If they can do it, so can we." The revolution was no longer an idea confined to pamphlets. It was a living, breathing thing, spreading like fire through dry fields. The call to arms echoed down dirt roads and across mountain passes. From Connecticut came wagon loads of gunpowder and flour. From Pennsylvania, iron for cannon and muskets. From the Carolinas, volunteers with hunting rifles slung over their shoulders. Farmers left their plows, merchants their ledgers, preachers their pulpits. They came on foot, on horseback, by river and by road, answering a summons that had no single author but every man's conscience. At first, the gathering was chaotic, a patchwork of militias in mismatched clothes, some carrying swords, others farm tools sharpened into weapons. Yet when they looked across the campfires at one another, they saw not strangers, but brothers. The accents differed, the prayers varied, but the cause was the same. Around every fire, men spoke of freedom, of rights, of a world where their children would not bow to kings. Each story told made the dream more real. In the midst of the camps, letters and speeches began to circulate appeals not to one colony, but to all. "We must hang together," wrote one pamphleteer, "or we shall hang separately." The words spread like scripture, uniting men who had never shared a flag before. The smoke that rose from the campfires around Boston was more than the smoke of battle. It was the signal of a new identity taking shape. For the first time, the colonies began to speak the same language, not of loyalty, but of liberty. The shock of battle had burned away hesitation, and in the ashes, something vast and fragile began to rise, a sense of nation. The farmers who had fired the first shots could not know it, but the world they had started was no longer theirs alone. America had found its voice, and it was speaking in 13 tongues as one. The farmers became soldiers, and rebellion became revolution. What had begun as a collection of militias, men in homespun coats and mismatched gear, was now gathering under a single banner. The siege of Boston had shown courage, but courage alone would not win a war. Out of the smoke and chaos came a realization: if the colonies were to stand against the greatest army in the world, they would need one of their own. The moment had come to forge unity into strength and resolve into command. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress debated late into the warm summer nights. The delegates argued over money, over loyalty, over what it meant to defy the king openly. Yet when word arrived that thousands of militiamen surrounded Boston, hungry but unyielding, the decision became clear. They voted to form the Continental Army, an army of the people, answerable not to a monarch, but to the cause of liberty itself. The war was no longer a rebellion of towns and farmers, it was a nation in the making. From Virginia came the man chosen to lead them, George Washington. He arrived in Cambridge in a plain blue coat, tall and solemn, his bearing as calm as it was commanding. The soldiers who watched him dismount from his horse saw neither the trappings of nobility nor the arrogance of power. They saw steadiness, discipline, and quiet conviction. Where their passion burned wild, he brought order. Where fear lingered, he brought purpose. Washington walked among the men, speaking little, observing much. He saw the raw courage that had driven them to fight at Lexington and Concord, but also the disorder that threatened to undo them. Muskets were rusty, powder scarce, and the men drilled more with instinct than precision. Some questioned why a Virginian should command the soldiers of New England, but within days his presence stilled those doubts. He embodied something larger than colony or region. He embodied the promise of unity. Discipline came slowly, and not without resistance. Farmers unused to command bristled at orders, and Washington's insistence on rules sometimes clashed with their fiery independence. Yet even as he demanded obedience, he never crushed their spirit. Liberty, he reminded his officers, is not license. Through him, rebellion found its structure. Through them, structure found its soul. Under Washington's watch, the ragtag encampment at Cambridge began to look like an army. Drums rolled at dawn, tents stood in neat lines, sentries marched their posts. From the scattered courage of the countryside, a force was taking shape, an army born not of empire, but of conviction. The farmers, who had once fired from behind stone walls, now stood shoulder to shoulder, saluting the same flag. The revolution was no longer a spark, it was a flame, disciplined and determined, ready to burn across a continent. While men fought for liberty, women fought for survival. As muskets thundered on the hills around Boston, another battle was being waged far from the front, quiet, relentless, and unseen. The men who had left their fields and forges to join the army left behind wives, mothers, and children to face a different kind of war. The revolution may have been born in gunpowder and blood, but it was kept alive in kitchens, barns, and candle-lit rooms, where the struggle for endurance never stopped. With fathers and sons gone, the farms fell to the women. They rose before dawn to plough frozen soil, mend fences, milk cows, and tend crops, their hands blistered and raw. When tools broke, they fixed them. When food ran low, they went without. Every letter from the front was read and reread until the ink faded. Every knock at the door brought a flash of dread. Yet even as they laboured, they carried the same spirit that had driven their husbands to fight an unspoken vow that the home would not fall while the men were gone. Children worked beside them, too young to understand the war but old enough to feel its weight. Boys guided oxen through the fields, girls gathered herbs and spun wool, their laughter dimmed by worry. Around the hearth at night, mothers spoke softly of freedom, of the fathers and brothers who would one day return. The firelight caught their faces tired, determined, unyielding. In their eyes, the revolution's endurance glowed just as fiercely as in any soldier's campfire. There were letters from the army, words of longing, fear, and pride carried miles through rain and mud. "Keep the farm," one husband wrote, "as you have kept my heart." Many never wrote again. When news of deaths reached the villages, there was no ceremony, no band, only the hollow ache of absence. Yet, even in grief, the work continued. Fields still needed tending, children still needed feeding, and liberty, however distant, still needed believing in. In some homes, widows and daughters took on new roles, organizing supplies for the militias, weaving uniforms, nursing the wounded. They formed networks of care and courage, sustaining the cause in ways that would never appear in history's ledgers. Their names rarely entered the record, but their endurance was the revolution's backbone. While the men battled on the front lines, it was the women who held the line at home. They fought not with muskets but with resolve, not in open fields but in the endless grind of survival. The revolution's courage was not confined to the battlefield it lived in, every hearth that stayed burning, every farm that kept its doors open, every heart that refused to break. Freedom was not won by soldiers alone. It was kept alive by those who stayed behind and endured. The story of Lexington and Concord spread faster than any army. Within days, riders carried the news down every road in the colonies. The farmers had stood, the redcoats had fired, and the first blood of liberty had been shed. But as the tale travelled, it began to change. Each retelling grew bolder, cleaner, and grander. The scattered shots on a village green became a heroic stand. The chaos of Concord became divine victory. The war for independence was still young, but already its legend was being born. In taverns and meetinghouses, the story was told and retold until truth and faith became indistinguishable. Minstrels wrote songs of brave patriots and tyrannical redcoats, verses sung to the rhythm of tankards striking tables. Preachers thundered from their pulpits that God himself had guided the farmer's aim, that heaven had blessed the cause of freedom. Mothers told the story to their children by firelight, each word a seed of pride planted deep in the next generation. Letters from the survivors carried the raw heart of those days. The smoke lay thick and the air burned with powder. One militiaman wrote, "I saw my neighbour fall beside me, and yet we stood." Others confessed their fear, the trembling hands, the confusion, the disbelief that they had faced an empire and lived. But their fear was transformed in the telling. What began as horror became honour. What began as grief became purpose. The names of the fallen spread through the colonies like sacred scripture. Towns held memorials in meetinghouses, bells tolled across the countryside, and lists of the dead were read aloud. For the first time, Americans mourned not as separate provinces but as one people. The blood spilled in those April fields had bound them together more tightly than any law or treaty ever could. Even in distant colonies, where no shot had yet been fired, the spirit of '75 took hold. Farmers in Virginia, merchants in Philadelphia, fishermen in Maine, all claimed the fight as their own. They raised toasts to the men of Lexington and Concord, calling them the first citizens of a free nation that did not yet exist. The legend became a compass, pointing the colonies toward a shared destiny. As months passed and new battles followed, the memory of those first April mornings only grew brighter. It was no longer a skirmish, it was the beginning of a story that every man, woman, and child believed themselves part of. The revolution was no longer only fought with muskets. It was carried in memory, in song, in spirit. The spirit of '75 had taken root, and it would never die. The men who once sowed fields now sowed freedom. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, they had been farmers, blacksmiths, and carpenters, men who measured life by the turning of seasons, not the tides of politics. But by the war's second year, many of those same men found themselves sitting in assemblies, writing petitions, and shaping laws. They had learned that liberty was not only something to fight for, it was something to build. The plowshare had become the pen, and the musket, the voice. Across the colonies, the veterans of the first battles returned home to fields overgrown and barns in ruin. Yet they brought with them a new understanding of power and purpose. They had faced redcoats and survived. Now they faced the harder task of governing themselves. Town meetings that once debated fences and harvests now argued about constitutions, armies, and rights. Every vote cast felt like a musket fired in defense of the new nation. Men who had never travelled beyond their county now spoke with confidence of liberty, sovereignty, and representation. John Adams, once a country lawyer, wrote of government for the people and by the people. Farmers who had fought beside him wrote letters to local assemblies demanding the same justice they had bled for. Freedom was no longer a distant dream, it was a daily duty. The revolution had begun in rebellion, but it was sustained by participation. The habits of the field shaped the habits of the republic. The same patience that grew corn now guided debate. The same endurance that held a firing line now tempered politics. In makeshift halls and candlelit taverns, men spoke of the rights of man with the same reverence they once gave to the weather and the soil. They were not scholars, yet their words carried the weight of lived conviction. Through them, the government of a new people began to take root. And yet, it was not easy. The ideals they had fought for demanded sacrifice and new arguments over slavery, taxation, and loyalty to state or nation. But they had already learned that freedom was forged through struggle. They had stood in smoke and blood and refused to yield. They would not yield now to division. The courage that had fired the first shots now lit the debates that would define a nation. From farmers came founders from ordinary lives, extraordinary vision. They had not sought greatness, only fairness, not glory, only dignity. Yet through their sweat and their stubbornness, they turned rebellion into republic. The seeds they planted in those fields of April 1775 were now blossoming into something vast and enduring, a government not of kings or generals, but of the people who once simply wished to be free. The revolution began not in palaces, but in pastures. It did not rise from marble halls or noble bloodlines, but from furrowed fields and weathered hands. The first shot that echoed across the green at Lexington was fired by men who owned little more than their faith and their courage. They were not trying to make history, they were trying to keep their homes, their dignity, and the right to stand as free men beneath the open sky. Yet in doing so, they changed the course of the world. Years later, when the smoke of war had cleared, and the young republic had taken its first uncertain steps, people would look back on that April morning as myth. Pain had softened into pride, and the names of the fallen became symbols. The farmers who had stood trembling with their muskets were remembered as the founders of a nation, the moment of their defiance retold as destiny. But beneath the legend lay a simple truth. Freedom had not been granted from above. It had been claimed from below. Generations grew up hearing the story. Children traced the outlines of muskets in history books. Preachers spoke of sacrifice from their pulpits. Poets turned the smoke of battle into verse. On anniversaries, the towns gathered where it had all begun, the descendants of those first soldiers standing where their ancestors once had. The wind still crossed the same grass, and the same church bell tolled, but now it rang not for alarm, but for remembrance. The world had changed beyond what those early militiamen could have imagined. Empires had risen and fallen, nations had been born and broken. Yet the idea they fought for, that ordinary people could decide their own fate, remained as alive as ever. Every movement for freedom that followed, every people who stood up against tyranny, could trace some small part of their courage back to that village green. The echo of that first shot had never stopped travelling. But the legacy was not without its questions. Freedom demanded vigilance as well as valour, unity as well as defiance. The farmers who took up arms had believed liberty was worth any price, yet each generation since has had to reckon with that cost anew. The revolution's promise was not a gift to be kept, but a challenge to be met, again and again. The story of that first shot is, at its heart, a reminder of where power truly begins, not in crowns, or parliaments, or armies, but in people willing to stand their ground when no one else will. The revolution began in the courage of common men, and its lesson endures. Freedom belongs not to those who inherit it, but to those brave enough to claim it.